Hello and welcome to this edition of Stories from the Strong Rooms. Today I'm going to tell you a bit about the early years of International Voluntary Service, originally called the International Voluntary Service for Peace, whose archive we hold here at Hull History Centre. IVS has been coordinating and offering volunteer placements in the UK since the 1930s, but its roots go back even further. Part of the archive is a series of glass slides and film negatives recording some of their early work, and we're going to have a look at some of them in this video. This is Pierre Sarasol on the left and his brother Ernst. Pierre was born in Switzerland in 1879 and studied engineering, before travelling through the USA and Europe. During the First World War he became a committed pacifist, and once the war was over he formed an organisation called Service Civil International and began to organise groups of volunteers to help communities in need. Ernst was a professional soldier, but he also joined the movement and supported Pierre in the work. The first group Pierre organised in 1920 worked on rebuilding a French village which had been badly damaged during the war. His idea was that better understanding between nations could be encouraged by bringing together volunteers of different nationalities to carry out physical labour, such as building houses or roads. This image shows Pierre with a group of volunteers in Liechtenstein, and it's captioned, "Pierre calling the volunteers to work." Service Civil International had gone to Liechtenstein in 1928 to help relief efforts after devastating floods the previous year. Its call for volunteers had responses from 710 people in 22 countries, whose ages ranged from 16 to 69. Service Civil International continued to respond to natural disasters in Europe, including floods in France and avalanches in Switzerland. And then in 1931, Pierre became aware of the Brynmore Experiments in Wales. This was a project set up by a Quaker group to try and bring relief to the community, which had been hit hard by unemployment following the 1926 general strike and the economic depression affecting the South Wales coalfields. The experiment tried to provide social relief and to create small-scale industry in the area. SCI offered to bring a group of volunteers to Brynmore to build leisure facilities in hopes of attracting tourism, and so in 1931 a 3-month work camp was held. It brought together volunteers from universities across the UK and volunteers from Europe and the USA. The volunteers were mostly men, with about 10 women who did the cooking, cleaning and mending, as well as some gardening. The volunteers created this swimming pool and paddling pool over the summer of 1931. This was a turning point for the movement in Britain, and a British branch of SCI was formed and named the International Voluntary Service for Peace. After a few teething problems, in 1935 the first IVSP constitution was drawn up. One of the longest projects IVSP undertook in Britain was at Oakengate in Shropshire. Part of the town was overshadowed by a huge spoil heap called the Charlton Mound, which covered 2.5 acres and was thought to contain between 40,000 and 80,000 tons of earth. In 1933 the local vicar, a Reverend Cartledge, undertook to get it removed. The area had high unemployment and it was impossible to raise the funds to pay for the work to be done, so Reverend Cartledge contacted IVSP. They felt it was a useful project and agreed to do the work. In this image you can see volunteers working on the mound and how they laid tracks and used railway carts to move the spoil, which was then used in constructing a new local estate. You can see in this image how large the mound was and how it would have dominated this area of the town. This is a rough plan showing the intended use of the Charlton Mound site once it was cleared. It included a library, gardens, a bus station, public buildings and potentially a swimming pool. You can get an idea of the size of the mound by how much was planned for the site after it was cleared. One of the first jobs was to level some ground to erect 2 army huts, which you can see in this image. One was used as a social club for local unemployed people, and the other was used as the headquarters for the volunteers. Until the huts were built, accommodation for the volunteers was in the church hall, and once the headquarters were ready, the volunteers slept and ate there. The huts were very close to the work site on the mound, as you can see from the carts in this image. Here we have some more volunteers working on the mound. One of IVSP's mottos was "Pick and shovel peacemaking," and that was definitely taken literally. As you can see, the volunteers are using picks and shovels to chip away at the mound. Volunteers came from all over Europe and were often, but not always, university students. There was also at least one volunteer from Hull, a Mr. G. Lamb. He was interviewed about his experience at Oakengates by the Hull Daily Mail in June 1938, where he was described as the local head of a big insurance concern. He spent his fortnight's holiday in 1938 at Oakengates, and he certainly took it seriously, leaving his car at home and hitchhiking to Shropshire. In the interview, he described working for 8 hours a day with a pick and shovel, and then spending the evenings in discussions with the other volunteers, which were translated into Danish, French, and German, as not all the volunteers spoke English. He also described the food they were given, saying, "We had meat only once a day, and that's a very small piece. The rest of the time we lived mostly on rice, boiled with onions to give it flavour." Despite the diet, Mr. Lamb said he thoroughly enjoyed his experience. The subject of food brings us to women's contribution to IVSP. Women who volunteered were referred to as sisters. They were given that title by Ernst Serasol, who, according to a history of IVSP published in 1948, quote, described their work as that of housewives first of all, to prepare the food, to keep the quarters in good order, to mend the clothes, to care for the sick. But he stresses that in addition to the material work they do, they perform a psychological or spiritual service in helping to create a family atmosphere, end quote. Women didn't usually take part in manual labour as they were thought to be unsuited to pick and shovel work, although they did sometimes do lighter work such as gardening or painting houses. This group of sisters were volunteers at Oakengates. By 1939, it was estimated that 80,000 tons of earth had been moved from the Charlton Mound, and there was just a small hill left. With the outbreak of the Second World War, work had to end, and the remaining part of the mound was planted with evergreens. Today the mound is completely gone, and in its place is Cartledge House, a former care home named after the Reverend Cartledge. We don't know who the man in this photo is, standing at the bottom of the mound with a book, but we like to think it's Reverend Cartledge himself, supervising the evergreens being planted. I wanted to end on this image, again from Oakengates, showing the IVSP principles: peace, a pick and a shovel. Two phrases which pop up again and again with IVSP are pick and shovel peacemaking and deeds not words, demonstrating the principles of working towards international peace through manual labour. IVSP continued to operate throughout the Second World War, providing volunteer work for conscientious objectors in forestry and air raid relief. From 1944 until 1950, IVSP worked alongside other charities to deliver relief in Europe, including in Greece, the Netherlands, and Germany. Through the second half of the 20th century, it continued to operate, although it dropped peace from its name and became simply IVS. It operated work camps in the UK and sent volunteers abroad, and today IVS still exists and supports volunteering in the UK and overseas. Thank you for joining me for this story from the Strong Rooms, and I hope you enjoyed hearing about the early years of IVS.